Welcome to Powerhouse. Welcome to Powerhouse. Joining us today is Sarah Hella, Asia Pacific's youngest master of wine. Welcome.
Thank you, Joyce. Really glad to be here.
And thanks for joining all the way from New Zealand, even though it's Zoom. So you're based in Hong Kong usually, now in New Zealand. Maybe we could start with a quick overview of your background and your current position.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Hong Kong. When I went to university, I was originally studying painting. And I think that was the direction I sort of assumed that my life would take. But while I was at college, I got interested in cooking. Being kind of a typical Hong Kong kid, I didn't really learn to cook when I was growing up. Living in an apartment with a bunch of other girls, but was sort of responsible for feeding myself, increasingly found that I loved cooking. And this was sort of the era of Top Chef being a huge thing. So I was caught up in the romance of that and decided that I wanted to be a chef. So I did some courses at the French Culinary Institute in New York and was actually planning on taking half a year off to go to culinary school, and asked my parents, and of course they were like, why don't you go work in a restaurant first, because that's free. And so through a series of contacts, I managed to get a job working at a restaurant actually in Piemonte, which is why I have this background, not just why I still love the region, but in Turin, working in a restaurant there. And of course, while I was there, my chef was obsessed with wine. So he would take me to the countryside and we would go tasting, and very quickly decided that that was much more the direction that was of interest for me than cooking all the time. And so got back to college. I was close enough to New York City that I could spend half of the week going to school in Connecticut, half of the week working in New York City at actually an Italian wine importer and distributor. And was all ready to work for them after college, but they sent me over the summer to work in a bunch of different wineries to kind of get some winemaking experience. And while I was at my first stop, I fell into a concrete tank and fractured my spine. I'm totally fine now. I completely recovered. However, at the time it was quite dramatic. So I had to move back to Hong Kong to recover. And while I was in Hong Kong, 2008 had recently happened and Hong Kong got rid of tax on wine. And so the wine industry in Hong Kong and in China were just exploding. And so it quickly became clear that rather than go back to the US, which was going through a difficult time financially, be much better off staying in Hong Kong and building my wine career there. From there, I ended up, I was originally working with Deborah Myberg, who was one of the first masters of wine in Asia, running her events business and education and these kinds of things. Got the Master of Wine in 2017. While I was studying, I had a couple of different projects. I was working on a wine brand in Spain. I had a little wine bar in Hong Kong at one point. But then since getting the Master of Wine, had a number of different things, sort of my kind of consistent roles. I'm the wine editor for Asia Tatler. I'm on the faculty of the Vin Italy International Academy, which is a wine education program developed by Vin Italy, which is the most important wine fair in Italy, for export markets to help people around the world understand Italian wine. And then in the meantime, I've also, starting in 2018, gone back to making visual art. So having taken this long hiatus, obviously I've finished my degree, but then while I was mainly focused on wine, really wasn't doing that much in the way of art, but started making first digital images and now a lot more painting that kind of encapsulates my experience tasting different wines.
I'm still kind of shocked by your accident, I suppose. Fracturing your spine, that must have been really tough. So maybe you can expand a little bit on how you got through that.
It's not what I think about that much, other than I've told the story, I'm sure you can imagine, hundreds of times. But in terms of it as an actual, the actual experience of it being challenging at the time, I haven't thought about that in a while, because in so many ways it ended up being fortuitous, because it did bring me back to Hong Kong, which is where I built my career, where I met my husband, where I had my kids. So really, a lot of the time, that's sort of the focus for me. I remember landing at the bottom of the tank and just thinking, I've ruined my whole life. What if I survive this, I'm going to be a broken person. Growing up, I rode horses. And so when you do that, you always have an awareness that you might have a catastrophic accident, and you know what to do. Like if you fall on your back, you're definitely not supposed to sit up, right? You're just supposed to kind of stabilize yourself, wiggle your toes, make sure nothing is damaged neurologically. But then, all of that advice goes out the window when you're suddenly in this panic situation, fallen 3 meters onto concrete. I heard the sound of my voice, and it was like I didn't recognize it. It was this totally out of body experience, even for about a week in the hospital, because I was in hospital in France and my French was passable. So I was not entirely clear on what my prognosis was. Like, was I going to be more or less okay, or was I going to be in this brace that they had put me in forever? Yeah, it was a really, really scary moment. It was kind of a slow process to get back to kind of a physical state where I felt comfortable that I would be independent living by myself. But on the other hand, what was really useful about it was the opportunity to just slow down. I think a lot of people have experienced that through COVID now. Like when all your choice is taken away, when all your ability to kind of fight back and keep hustling is taken away, you just stop and reassess and think about what do I really want to do? What's really important to me? Yeah, that ended up being one of those experiences that just really slowed down, really took some time to figure out what to do next.
Were there certain things that you had to like really think about during that whole process? And how long was the process actually?
So to completely recover was probably 10 months, close to a year, but I was getting towards normalcy earlier than that. Yeah, I was in the brace for 4 months. So what things was I considering at that point? One thing, this is more kind of personal, but I hadn't really thought particularly that I wanted to have a family necessarily. I was feeling very independent, and like I didn't need any familial support. I didn't want to be reliant on anybody else. And then there was that realization that no matter how independent we think we are, at a certain point, our familial bonds, all the sort of structures that help us keep sane are so important to maintain. So just, yeah, I think in some ways it was more of a personal realization than professional per se.
So you mentioned you worked with Deborah Meinberg before, and that kind of helped you, inspired to kind of further along your wine journey. Maybe you can explain a bit more about why you like wine so much, and how did you get through the kind of Master of Wine program? Because it's obviously a very rigorous program, and so we can talk a little bit about that journey.
Been thinking more and more about what it is that makes it so special, and it is kind of like art for a different set of senses, right? I think as a culture, we're very comfortable with placing visual stimuli and auditory stimuli as art. I think that speaks more to the fact that we undervalue certain senses. Like we don't have anywhere near the regard for smell, for instance, that we do for eyesight, right? I think we think of ourselves as intellectual beings. Eyesight is the most important sense. And so this realization of how wine kind of connects people to their own history, to the history of the culture that they're a part of, to just it's like this incredibly complex web connecting people to their own history, and how it would just expand all these different horizons for learning about people was what was so interesting about it in the first place. The way that the Master of Wine works, I think this is true of any academic subject, when you have to be really objective and kind of analytical, very much sort of lose the romantic side of things, and all the kind of magic dissipates a little bit. But then it gets you from some other angle, because, for instance, I found the organic chemistry side of studying for the Master of Wine super interesting. So even when, I've kind of been robbed of all the romance of wine and terroir and all of that, I had another angle from which I could be excited about it. So that, yeah, I think it's that it keeps opening up facets of things to learn about and new experiences to have. With any subject, the more you know about it, the more you realize there's so much more to know about it. I think when we're at very beginning phases of learning about something, it's like, oh, okay, well, once I know this amount of things, I will be an expert and that'll be enough. But it's very much not that way. And working for Deborah early on, seeing her continued enthusiasm and ability to find new facets of wine to get excited about was encouraging to me. It kind of gave me a template for how I could continue to be engaged, not just with wine specifically, but how wine would create all these opportunities to do different things. Like, if not that this was necessarily my aspiration growing up, but if I'd wanted to be on television, wine has provided a path for me to do that. I think particularly by having done the Master of Wine, which by design is an extremely generalist program. It kind of gets you to understand wine from every aspect, from making it, marketing it, kind of even, this might be a slightly pretentious way, but kind of philosophy of wine and what role wine plays in culture. All of those things are aspects of the Master of Wine.
While you're doing the program, was there any aspect of it that surprised you in terms of, oh, well, this is what you have to learn, like relating to wine? I never thought that I need to do this, you know.
Something that immediately comes to mind as something that I never thought would be interesting was quality control. It sounds so boring, but just like thinking about quality control of manufacturing through the lens of wine makes you think about like the whole world of manufacturing and supply chains and how interconnected everything is. Something that I think people became hyper aware of right, during COVID, where suddenly people realize how everything that we eat or use and like comes through supply chains that are really global. That realization came to me through the lens of wine while I was studying.
You mentioned the opportunity to be on TV. Maybe you can explain a little bit because you're also a TV host. Kind of expand on that opportunity and what do you do on that program as well?
So the program was initiated by a team out of Holland. The guy Joyce Yung, he's actually a feature film director, but really likes wine, I think kind of as a hobbyist, and developed an interest in creating kind of cinematic quality documentary series about wine. So the first season he did was actually on France. So I was not part of that series. But then the second season was about Italy. So it's sort of a funny story of how it came about. The title of the documentary series was Wine Masters. And of course, the Institute of Masters of Wine, which is the body that awards the Master of Wine title, based in London, is extremely protective of the name Wine Master or Master of Wine. So when it came to their attention that this documentary series was being made with this title, Wine Masters, they kind of approached class and were like, that's it's not, I think he might even originally have been calling it Masters of Wine, which was problematic because not everybody he was using necessarily was going to be a Master of Wine. And so what came out of that was that, in fact, they decided to change the name of the show to Wine Masters. And all of the hosts have ended up being Masters of Wine. And so I was brought on for the second season for Italy because that's my area of specialty.
And how did you choose Italy as your specialty then throughout your studies or your wine journey?
Well, it mainly arose because that was the kind of restaurant I was working in. As I had mentioned, when I was in university, I went to courses at the French Culinary Institute. I was learning French. I was interested in sort of French culture. And so I'd always assumed that would be the direction I would take. But then when I was taking my year off of university to go work in a restaurant somewhere, asked around a very little bit, and absolutely no French people were interested in having me come work for them. I think it was sort of, people looked at me like, well, you haven't been peeling potatoes since you were 12. You're not of interest to us. Whereas the Italian kitchens were all like, sure, come along. I was working briefly, interning for a chef in Hong Kong at an Italian restaurant. And I had planned on going back to the US and working at an Italian restaurant in the US. It's like, well, that's stupid. Why not? Why not just go to Italy? It's like, well, I don't have a visa. So that kind of the Italian attitude to everything is why Italy, because it's just a wonderfully welcoming in a lot of ways.
So, and also like you've mentioned, you do many different types of relating to wine, and maybe you can explain the one project that you work on that's surprising or that's not something you thought about, but wine opened up the door, and maybe some of the kind of process and any challenge along the way as well.
One of my projects that has been very eye-opening and kind of brought me to a part of the world that I probably wouldn't have spent that much time in, but for wine, is the wine brand I kind of worked on that's based out of Austria called the Almaji Collection. The backstory to that one, the Almaji family are an Austrian noble family. So they are kind of the quintessential Central European family in the sense that they're Hungarian background. They can trace their ancestry back to Transylvania in 1100, and they gradually made their way west until the area where they settled, which was Hungary, became part of Austria. And Central Europe, it's kind of the in-between lands that fall between the German sphere of influence and the Russian sphere of influence. All these different ethnic groups and cultures kind of sandwiched together. We felt like there was a culture, but that had been so kind of kept at bay by all the conflict over the past couple of hundred years, to the extent that its wines, while in the era of the Enlightenment or the late Baroque, were recognized as being great wines, in kind of modern history have been forgotten about, and many of the grape varieties people don't know about. And so we just felt like there were a huge number of undiscovered treasures there, where the raw material was excellent, but the possibility for those people of marketing and exporting and telling their story to a broader audience was really limited. So the project was to gather a portfolio of wines every year, initially on the spot market, so just buying wines that were available and bringing them under this one brand umbrella, kind of trying to replicate the cellar that the Almaji family would have had, had Central Europe not had this hundreds of years of conflict, right? If instead of all this sort of war and strife, it had been a peaceful, unified area. We released the first collection, and we were in the process of putting together the second when COVID started. So the whole thing has been massively disrupted by that. But when I get back to Hong Kong, I have a new batch of wines to taste for the next round. So hopefully we'll be able to get that back up and running.
Now, did you have to travel a lot pre-COVID to different wine regions or just for business?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was one of the reasons why, in certain ways, COVID was a little bit of a relief. Was just, I think, like so many people, pre-COVID life was very unsustainable. Especially having two young children, being away once a month, twice a month, maybe 3 times a month is really not the way I want to run my life. And the wine industry, I was talking to a winemaker today who was saying that in the year preceding COVID, he was on a plane every other day. It's just too much. The planet can't sustain it. Our health, our sanity can't sustain it. It's not the way forward. But it took something as catastrophic as COVID to make us all realize, and to get out of that gradual ratcheting up. So I don't think I'll ever go back to traveling as much as I was traveling then. I think it'll be much more one long journey and then remaining in a particular place for a significant stretch of time, kind of like what I've done this year, although maybe not quite so long.
So I want to talk back, kind of circle back to what you talked about, is merging your wine and design and art background.
The two most prominent projects for that direction. One was kind of an outside project that came to me in a way. One of the first organizations to approach me was, it's actually the parent company is called Ocean Glass, but they own a crystal glassware brand called Lucas. And I'd worked with them before a little bit here and there, but they approached me right away and said, we really want to work with you. We'd like you to be a brand ambassador and also work with us on a new collection. And I thought that was super exciting. And then had this panic of like, what is this new collection going to be? Because there's so much glassware, there's so much wine glassware, and different ideas and different sort of concepts behind them and different styles. And I went away and thought about it. And a thing I'd realized in the course of my research for my Master of Wine, my research paper had been about, incidentally, e-commerce for wine in China, focusing on millennials. So what is it that millennials are looking for when they're buying wine online? And one of the key learnings from that was that people were more drawn to feelings, general feelings, rather than specific descriptions of wine. So rather than hearing that a wine tastes like blackberries and plums, people were more interested to hear that it was mellow or rounded. It would be a sort of loose, vague set of descriptors, but that fit a certain mood And that was what they wanted out of all of their wines, not particular wine flavors necessarily. And that got me to thinking that in wine, there's an assumption that there is a correct way of doing things. And, subjectively, you may like something more than another, but that's not what's really important. It's objectively, this is better quality than that. And that just struck me as fine from an academic standpoint, but not really applicable to real life. Like ultimately, you can yell at somebody all you want. The wine that you don't like is good, but they're going to continue to like it and buy it. And so why should we not be shaping experiences for people to enjoy them? So the idea with the glassware was that the glass would make the wine taste and feel the way that the person who's drinking it wants it to taste and feel. Obviously, it's not, you're not going to take a Chardonnay and turn it into a Pinot Noir, right? That's not going to happen. But you can take the same Chardonnay and shape it. I had this idea, but I didn't know exactly what form to give it. I was thinking about what are concepts that kind of bridge cultures. It's like, but it should also be something that relates to wine, which for the most part, at least as of the moment, is more of a kind of Western European, or not Western European, but a Western / European cultural phenomenon. And I came up with the idea of the elements, right? It's something that a cultural concept that bridges East and West, if you will, right? There's Ayurveda, there's traditional Chinese medicine that have their ideas of what the natural elements are. Greek philosophy that has its idea of what the natural elements are. And so we kind of chose a couple of elements that we felt were representative and associated with the glass shapes with them. So we have a water glass, we have a fire glass, an earth glass, and each of those brings out that trait in the wine. So the water glass makes it taste fresher and cleaner. It took ages to get these shapes, both to look the way we wanted, to sort of immediately from the moment you see them stimulate the idea of that element, but then also physically work to make you physiologically sense the wine differently. So that was 3 years in the making.
Wow. Well, was it really hard to get the physical part, I guess? Is it, like, do you have to kind of really study the shape of the glass and anything that's in the glassware that kind of makes it along with that theme of water or fire, etc.?
Definitely. So, I mean, initially, to be honest, the concept was quite out there, but the shapes were quite conservative. And then I showed the designs to the team in Thailand, and they were like, can't we do something that looks a bit more fun? Can't we do something that looks a bit more unusual? It's like, okay. So then I got my sort of visual mind out, and we went all the way in the other direction. So we had an air glass that looked like a cloud. Right? It was just like all these puffs, and we had a fire glass that really looked like flames. And then at that point, we realized also that there was no way we were going to be able to achieve these shapes with machine blowing, which is mainly what this company does. And so that was a scary thought. So we from there decided to go with hand blowing, which actually worked out brilliantly in the end because we had much smaller production runs. So it allows us to change really quickly. And in an era of COVID, when people aren't buying huge quantities of anything, it's much better to be, I think, in the position that we're in at the moment where we can adapt our designs. We have limited runs, so when they come, people buy them up quickly. It's also, they're really well designed for consumers at home because people like the idea of having their personal glass that really suits them. So people who are buying for home consumption versus restaurants, where I think the concept does also work, but it's just no restaurants are buying anything right now.
And your other visual project is painting and drawing as well?
About 3 years ago now, I was looking for a way to talk about wine visually, because I knew that was my background and that I had this strength in communicating visually. And I like to write, but I was finding myself writing wine notes and just using the same vocabulary over and over again. And it felt kind of like I wanted another outlet. So I started making very simple images initially, just kind of little watercolors with at first hand collage and then very quickly digital collage, just so I could get them out there very quickly. So I was posting them on Instagram. and just the interest was really there. I felt like I'd really struck a nerve,
Mm.
and people were responding to these. It wasn't really bringing another dimension through the fact that it was an image.
Right.
Whereas what I was trying to do was a little bit more abstract
Mm.
and more about capturing an impressionistic sense, not something that you could replicate with words in
Mm.
the image. And then gradually just gotten more complex. So started sometime last year making paintings again rather than just the digital images. So I'm still doing some digitally, but then using some of the digital material to create sort of the ideas for paintings, and then sometimes making prints of the digital pieces and painting on top. And yeah, it's been really, really fruitful and rewarding.
Do you collaborate with different brands, or what's your selection process, I guess, on different projects?
One of the things I learned from working with Deborah, because she had lots of different projects going, particularly when I was working for her, she's since focused more on events, which actually was not really my strength. It was a realization that I wanted to have many things going at once, but not too many, so that I would feel like I was spreading myself too thin. And I had initially assumed going into it that it would be good for me to initiate all of the ideas, like for them to originally come from me and then find the right people to work with. But I think it's actually more of a balance, right? Because if you're the originating source for everything that you're doing, then everything relies on you to keep it moving. And then it becomes impossible to sustain. Certainly right before COVID, and I think increasingly now again, I have reached a good balance where there's enough stuff that I'm pushing myself, and enough things where there's somebody else who's kind of the pull, that the time kind of works out, right? There's a demand for, like, I need to provide a certain number of articles for something by a certain date. That kind of creates a structure to my day, and then I know that I have X amount of time to spend on my self-initiated projects. But it's hard. I mean, especially when people approach and it's something you hadn't remotely thought about doing, and it doesn't really fit in with anything else you're doing, but you get very excited about it and it completely distracts you from your own stuff. That's very frustrating.
Is there any biggest mistake along the way of your wine journey? Any kind of big mistake and challenge that you came across, and how did you quickly either pivot away or overcome it?
Nothing insurmountable, but definitely there have been projects I've gotten involved with where I realized that the choice of project and or partner was not a good one. The mistakes have come when I've realized that my skill set and what I bring and what the other person brings are not actually complementary, but I didn't realize it to begin with, right? Like a lot of people, especially, wine is such a social industry that you feel like you have great synergies with people very early on, and people get into projects with each other, I think, a bit too quickly a lot of the time. And people are a bit reticent to talk about the kind of cold hard business of it up front, because everybody assumes that somebody else is getting some intangible benefit from it. There are a lot of assumptions about what each person is getting from something. Whereas I think if you were dealing in ball bearings, right, like you would discuss all these things up front, right? You would have a contract, and everybody would be very clear about what everybody was getting out of the deal. And in wine, it can be hard to have those discussions because you don't want to seem ungracious or like you're only in it for the money, right? So my advice to anybody who's in my position, who's kind of a solopreneur, right, trying to figure out what projects to get involved with, who to get involved with, is to really make sure that whatever the project is that you're getting involved with, it completely fulfills at least one of the goals that you're seeking in your kind of web of projects that you're building, right? So if you're doing something for the prestige, it should be super prestigious. It shouldn't be like 6 out of 10 prestigious.
Right.
And then if it's 10 out of 10 prestigious, then don't worry about the money. Right. But if you're doing something for the money, obviously you don't want it to be brand damaging, but the money had better be really good, right? To compensate for it maybe not being the most prestigious project. And then the second layer of that is to make sure that the people involved are going to be able to help you achieve whatever that goal is. They don't somehow think that you're willing to do it for prestige when you're thinking of this as one of your money-making projects.
So the expectation has to match, and it's good to have that conversation more openly, right?
Yeah, no, one thing I will say about having gotten the Master of Wine and sort of established expertise, and also kind of scarcity, because there are only about 400 Masters of Wine in the world, so there's kind of a cachet to the title, is being in a position where people assume that they have to pay you for things. Whereas when I was still studying, I remember a lot of the time I would go in sort of thinking, oh, this is finally a project where I'm going to make a decent income. And the person would say, well, you'll have access to our network. This will be really good for you. Well, that doesn't pay my bills. Thank you. That sounds great.
So getting the Master of Wine definitely helps cement that, I guess. And that is actually, I do want to ask a little bit more. So before you got Master of Wine, did it take a long time to establish yourself? And as you said, then a lot of expectation could be just partnership versus paid projects. Do you feel like that took a while? And is that one of the push to kind of do the Master of Wine as well?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm completely honest, the Master of Wine, partly because of the scarcity, which I mentioned just now, which is kind of exaggerated in Asia because there are only ever about 10 in Asia. The scarcity of it and the nature of the people who have had it in Asia, who've really kind of positioned it, I think, well, as a real kind of authoritative title, has made it such that I think if you go through the program and achieve the title, it pays dividends in terms of improving your position, your ability to mount a certain fee for projects and different things like this, or gain prestigious titles or whatever else it is that you want to achieve in the industry. It really does open doors in that regard. And I don't know of many qualifications in other industries that have that kind of cachet. Honestly, a lot of the other things that I did leading up to the Master of Wine were good in terms of building my experience and my understanding of the industry and building my contacts, like my network. But very little compares with having gotten the title, which I had kind of hoped would be the case, but I think as it happened, played out to an even greater extent than I expected, because there hadn't been that many people get the title recently in Greater China for a while. And there was this surge of kind of Hong Kong sentiment, right? So the fact that I was the first Hong Kong born Master of Wine, a lot of Hong Kong organizations kind of embraced me for that. And I was very grateful for that, of course. And so it was a huge boost in a way that it might not have been if like 5 people had gotten it immediately before me, for instance.
That's great. It's an amazing achievement. Any other advice for audience that either looking to get into this industry or just setting up, becoming an entrepreneur themselves?
On the wine industry is very hard. If you like wine, I would strongly recommend just staying in whatever job it is that you are in currently and enjoying wine in your free time. It's not an industry that you should enjoy, that you should join purely because you enjoy drinking wine, although there is a lot of that. In terms of what I would advise people who are looking maybe to become solo entrepreneurs and have a series of different projects based on kind of central expertise, is to really go very, very deep on developing that expertise, even if it means that you have to take time out from building your career, having that base, having it acknowledged in some way, like a qualification or a title or something. Nobody can ever take that away from you. Right? If once you have that, it'll allow you to branch out into any number of directions, but you need to really build that foundation. I see a lot of people my age who leave corporate jobs and then are interested in all kinds of different things. Like they're like, I'm interested in food, and they dabble here and dabble there. And it takes a lot of time to add up to anything because they don't invest the time to train or build a business, whatever it is, where they dedicate a lot of time to one particular thing. I think that is necessary before you can start to branch out in all other directions.
Great. That's great advice. So last question, any upcoming projects, either personal or business related?
So I'm hoping to be able to record more of the documentary series that I mentioned before next year in Amsterdam, or not in Amsterdam, sorry, in Holland. That'll be a number of different wine regions. So looking forward to getting back to that. We are going to be doing a lot more activity in Hong Kong around my glassware, because it kind of soft launched last year. But I think we'll be doing more promotional activities, trying to get people to understand that glassware is so much more about your personal taste than about doing what is correct. And then the third thing is kind of exhibitions of the paintings. I'm hoping to get in at least one in the second half of this year, and possibly more going into 2022.
Awesome. Amazing projects and achievements and advice. Thank you very much.